Hello everyone, it is I, the Witch of Paint. Today I will try out the 100% cotton Rhodia cold press watercolor sketchbook, which is ring bound, which I have mentioned before that I don't like ring bound books, but this one's okay. I'm not going to be removing the pages or anything, so it's fine. In this video we'll also be trying out both the Devon tinted charcoal paint set as well as the Winsor Newton designer gouache paints. Last week I had already swatched and prepared a light fast test for these paints, so this week we are going to be doing some proper paintings with the paints, see how I handle them and stuff. So let's take a look at the first painting that I did in this sketchbook. This was done with my new Devon tinted charcoal paint set, as I have mentioned before, and since I had swatched the colours beforehand, I had decided that it was best to do a somewhat muted landscape-ish freehand painting without a proper plan. I know, not exactly, a smart move, but I just wanted to do something quick and easy that would tell me how the paper and the paints behaved in a painting setting. I started by spreading water across the paper and creating a somewhat loose base for my painting. I used the mountain blue for the sky because it is the lightest blue I have available in this palette. Then I thought I'd add some of the dark moss to get some greenery into the painting, some bushes, and eventually I ended up doing some trees, and for some darkness in the first layer I also added one of the ember colours. I think it was glowing embers, but I didn't take notes since I just wanted to do this quick and easy. And I still need to learn to take notes. Throughout this, you of course have to keep in mind that I'm doing this particular painting without a reference or a plan of what I want. I'm just kind of going with intuition and with just going with the flow as I'm trying to get to know the paints. So most of the brush strokes that I'm making are going to be very random and make it look like I really don't have a plan, which is exactly the case, as I've said. But that's fine. I don't really need a plan to work with watercolours. I will take a reference for the second painting because I'm not as familiar with gouache paints. But for this one I am not taking any references or anything like that. I added the vague outline of a tree on the right hand side, along with dotting in the leaves with the dark moss that at this point was mixed with probably forest pine, or maybe it wasn't mixed at all, but I did so much mixing in this painting that I kind of lost track of things. But I did want it to be a little bit darker, and then for the tree itself I also used some burnt ember to add a darker texture to the tree for the first layer. That was just layer number 1. Layer number 2 I mixed some forest pine with dark moss and possibly some other colours too that my mind doesn't quite recall. So far the paper seems to have a nice texture to it and the colours look very nice on it. I'm enjoying this so far. It doesn't dry quite as quickly as the Devon paints do in their paint pan. I seriously don't know what is up with that. It's just so weird. It's like you activate the paints with your brush, you lift off the brush, move to the paper, and by the time you look at it again, it's already dry, the paint in the pan. It's just a bit weird. Although I went rather dark with the paints very quickly, as I did mention before, I didn't have a plan for what this painting was going to be, so I just dotted around the green paint and didn't pay attention to how dark I was getting. And then I had to work with that, which isn't all that bad, it's fine. I added some lighter, very vague green forest in the background, trying to make it look a little bit misty. Because once I started to properly, work with the colours and stuff, they started to kind of look like something to use for misty paintings. It's like they give the painting an immediate mood from the moment they are put down, and they work together very nicely. Although I still think that the burnt embers and burnt earth look a little bit too similar. Would have been nice to have one of them look a little more different, maybe have burnt embers be a little more orangish or something, just something that kind of gives you the feeling of burnt embers. I don't know, the brownish colour that it has just doesn't give burnt embers to me. Burnt earth I can get is brown, but burnt embers? Embers are, well, even if they're burnt, they're still kind of glowing maybe, although glowing embers is already a colour which is kind of reddish. So I guess it makes sense in some way, I don't know. Could have been some other colour. I decided to put the faint shapes of trees in the background to give the painting just that little bit more depth. You can see that at this point I finally managed to define my shapes a little bit more as I give the tree a thinner trunk so that it can match the general size of everything else and also look okay without me thinking, why is that tree so thick? Although everything still looks rather dark in the foreground and then the background is just very light. I mean, I was trying to kind of go for a misty look, but you know, I feel like it's kind of missing like a middle bit that's kind of ties it together. But it's fine, I wasn't going for a masterpiece, I was going for a quick painting that I could use to just quickly test out the sketchbook that I had. At this point I decided to try out the white to add some snow on top of the leaves just to see what it looked like. And I gotta say, as I put it down, it did not look like it was going to do much. So I just kind of left it be after I dotted it around and spread it across the brushes. What I wasn't aware of was that the white apparently dries to be very opaque, which isn't quite clear by the end of the painting process here, but you will see what I mean when I show you all the final result. Just, you know, keep in mind that I wasn't aware of how opaquely the white was going to look when it was dry. I just thought it was going to do almost nothing when I put it down. And I mean, I suppose usually I don't really use white unless it's for something like snow, as I am trying to do in this case. And I just wanted to see how it was going to look, but I wasn't aware how it was going to look in the end, really, because I have never worked with these paints before, but now I know that the white apparently dries a lot more opaquely than before. Anyways, we're done with that painting. We can take off the tape, sign it, and then move on to the gouache painting. For the gouache painting, I decided to paint it in a portrait kind of orientation because I didn't want the rings of the ring-bound sketchbook getting in the way of my hands. As I've mentioned, I don't like ring-bound sketchbooks. And for this painting, I'm also going to be using a reference because I'm not familiar enough with gouache paints to just go in without a plan. The reference I'm using is something I wanted to paint a while back ago. I took a picture in a forest where we were walking during the autumn season because I thought it was very fun to see the orange path and then just the green trees and the green ivy and all that. That nice contrast between the green and the red-orange of the path. It was just magical in a way, so I just kind of went with that for this. But I started this very similarly to the watercolour painting. I wet the page completely and mapped out the general shapes. Orange for the path, green for the trees, with some yellow for the trees in the middle as the sun was shining on them. And obviously this sky was painted blue. I must admit, adding the yellow in the middle was a very risky move. It was incredibly bright and bothered me for almost the entirety of this painting. Overall, these colours were so much more bright than I was used to working with. It obviously took me a while to get used to the colours themselves and mixing with them as well, though it was a little bit difficult too because it involved me contaminating the different colours a little bit as I didn't want to wash my brush off between using the colours so much because my paint water was getting dirty and I didn't like that. I just hope that won't become a problem when I try to use them again, you know. I'll just slowly work with them, get to know them better and all that stuff. Once the first layer is dry, I decide to first define the areas of sky because they are behind the trees and trying to paint it after the trees would be a pain. I knew that much. Plus it gave me a good idea of where the trees were going to go, sort of. I know that the blue shapes look very, very random, but trust me, it's all part of the plan I had. Then I took a darker mix of red because the path isn't a bright orange, at least definitely not as bright and pastel as it looks in the first layer. But then it wound up looking too red, so I added some more yellow into the mix again for an orange and painted it along the edges of the path. With a lot of struggling and trial and error, I managed to mix a sort of brown colour eventually. That was probably the hardest thing to do with these paints. I am used to having at least burnt sienna at my disposal for brown tones. I don't usually mix them myself. And at that moment, I kind of wasn't sure how to mix the colours to make the brown. Even though I technically had a booklet that explained colour theory to me, but who needs to read that? Eventually I got it though, yay! And then I continued to struggle mixing brown for the entirety of the rest of this painting. I don't know why. Maybe eventually I will figure out the secret of mixing brown tones with gouache. But I think if I want to add a last colour to this gouache palette, which does have a space left, I think it would be a brown colour. Maybe burnt sienna or burnt umber. For the time being though, I will struggle making dark colours for the trees. Particularly the middle part of the painting made me struggle because it was really dark, but I didn't want to just use straight up black because that doesn't really exist in nature. Another issue I had, particularly when I tried to use a smaller brush, was that the gouache's texture kind of didn't go down very well. But I think that is more of the fault of me, not knowing gouache as well as I know watercolours, rather than it being the fault of the gouache paints. I'm just not used to working with something that's thick in texture and gloopy. I think my greatest mistake with this painting though was using just yellow to paint the parts of the trees that had sunlight shining on them. It looks way too bright and weird in my opinion, but layering these paints on top of each other worked out well enough, even if the colour was lighter than the one it was being painted over. Which is something I clearly don't happen to have a lot, especially with my watercolours, because they're transparent and they don't really go light on dark, they go light to dark. You start with light and then end in dark. You can't just go from dark to light, that's not how it works. No surprise really though, these paints were not cheap, gouache paints after all. I need to make sure in future when I paint with these that I don't wash my brushes often, as I've said, because otherwise I might be wasting 1, too much paint, and 2, I would have to change out my paint water 1 too many times, and I'm used to just having to use 1 glass, or I suppose 2, because I always have 1 for dirty paint water and 1 for clean paint water, just in case I need some clean painting water to spread across the page. But I would have to change out both of those 1 too many times if I keep just washing off my brushes as I please with gouache paints. That's just something I need to keep in mind in the future. Anyway, eventually I had figured out how to mix with these paints, at least somewhat okay, so I managed to improve the painting as I continued. Yay! Adding the green leaves, the ivy and other green things that are around this painting really helped bring it together quite nicely in my opinion. It was just like, now it's finally looking like something good. This is why we push through the ugly and weird phases of our paintings, because in the end we may figure out how the paints, the brush and the composition works. And then it suddenly clicks and you love the end result. Or it doesn't click and you don't like it, but you know, there's always that risk when you're an artist of you not liking the painting. Someone else may like it though, so you know. With some brighter yellow-orange colour, I added highlights on the trees as well. No, I also didn't take any notes on what colours I was using for the mixes during this painting because I'm also still learning with the gouache paints and I was too busy trying to figure out how to do the mixing right that I didn't think about taking notes of what colours I was mixing together even though that might have been very useful for things like, you know, mixing brown maybe. It would be better to just store that in a note rather than in my head. Notes are useful, guys. But that same yellow tone was also used to brighten up the path in some areas, really bring out the autumn leaf look that I was after, and in an attempt to cover up my yellow leaves, I mixed up a more yellowish green because I didn't like how bright the yellow looked and it just kind of was a little bit distracting, so I just kind of tried to tame it a little bit. The same colour was used to kind of lighten up the ivy on the trees, and one last thing I did was to attempt to darken the area where the path disappears. The trees there are incredibly dark in the original image, so the reference that I'm using, so I tried to do it justice and just went in dark, and I know that for the painting process it looks like there's just a very dark blob there, but I promise once it's dry it looks okay. I added a little more leaves to the background trees, but then I decided it would be best to just stop at this point because it was looking decent enough and I was just going for decent and okay and just something somewhat quick. So I took off the tape and signed it before letting it dry properly. Now we can talk about the final results. First, the painting I made with the tinted charcoal set. This was a very quick one, just 15 minutes. Really, I just wanted to try out the paints and see how the paper is and nothing more. I like the colours and the moody, misty feeling this painting gives off, like a little forest scene in the early morning when everything is covered in fog, like the fog that I am very familiar with. Living on a hill at the west coast of Ireland, I'm very used to these kind of misty things, so they just kind of feel like very homey to me. They're really beautiful, I like it. And as you can see, the white dried incredibly opaquely compared to what it looked like when I first put it down on the paper. I will just have to keep that in mind and maybe for future things remember to test the white on black paper just to see how it does. For the gouache paints, well, it looks a little bit abstract, perhaps more so than my usual style, but I do like that in a way. I'd say the more I use gouache, the better I'll get at it, and this year we will try to use it more often. And the middle part luckily doesn't look so muddied anymore, which is great, even if compared to the watercolours it is a bit more bright. It is very beautiful. Not bad for someone who's not used to using gouache, eh? Also, final thoughts on the Rhodia sketchbook overall. I like the texture, even if front and back have different textures overall. What I don't like about it is that it's ring-bound rather than, bound with thread and probably glue or something like that. I just think that sometimes the rings could get in the way if I'm, trying to draw on the back of the paper. Because I'm right-handed, that's the only time it might get in the way, unless I do it portrait like I did with the gouache painting, which I purely did to avoid that issue of the rings getting in the way of my hand. But anyways, that was it for me today. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like please, I would really appreciate that. And if you haven't already done so, subscribe to the channel. I also have an Instagram link down below, and a Twitch channel and a Discord, if you'd like to check them out. For the time being, I am the Witch of Paint, and I shall see you all next Sunday. Bye! Oh look, who's made it to the end of the video. Well done to you! I, as always, have some fun outtakes for you to listen to while the video wraps up. Have fun! Probably mixed with forest pine or another colour. And now the other phone goes off. Maybe it's just because I've been a lot of around mist and fog. I don't know, the brownish colour that it is doesn't really give burnt embers. Bleh. With a lot of struggling and error and trial, isn't it trial and error? Goodness me, who wrote this script?